So after putting on all those 10,000 something little rectangles to emulate the pattern on the outside of this 688, it is finally time to paint and weather it, and this is the result of that painting and weathering, so let's dive into the process together. Flashback to like 3 weeks ago, and we finished putting all the little rectangles on the 688, and now it is time to get into the painting process. I waffled a little bit on how I wanted to paint this, and I'll describe that as we get along, but I always prime my models to start. I like using this Tamiya fine surface primer, as you'll see me use a lot, just because it is super easy to use, and part of the reason why I always prime my models is to quickly pick out any defects before I get putting the base color on there, fix those up, sand them out, reprime as needed. I noticed there were some spots around the sail and around the bow on the nose here where I needed to go back and fill. Primer just makes spotting stuff like that easy. Vice after applying your base color and having to try and fix it then. So to start this off, I am going to kind of inverse my normal black basing technique because this is going to be a black scale model. I'm going to use these two mottling stencils from Masterpiece Models because looking at reference photos, the pattern doesn't really show any individuality and it all kind of blends together. Once I get that mottling down, I'm going to be laying this Hakata Hobby NATO Black over top. Whenever I have to paint something black besides a car, I pretty much just always reach for this NATO Black. It's got a nicer color that I think is more true to life. Here's how the mottling turned out after using those Masterpiece Model stencils, and then I went through and basically painted the under half in just straight black because I felt that the NATO Black emulated that fading that you get in real life, and with no sun coming from underneath, it's not going to fade. So basically from this midpoint down, I painted it just straight black, and then I'll do the top here in a NATO Black. Basically a thin blend coat, build it up in many, many layers so that the shading still shows through above this waterline here, but we don't have to worry about basically ruining that shading. And here, if you look closely, you can see there's that variation in shading. The areas that were black underneath appear more black on the surface, and the areas that were gray underneath appear more of a brownish kind of hue or a lighter black, more characteristic of that NATO Black, basically. It just adds visual interest and some tonal variation that I really like to incorporate in my models, and it helps make it look more interesting, especially with something like this that basically is just a black tube. With the base coat applied, I am going to apply a super clear gloss varnish from MRP just to give a nice slick finish before doing the post shading with oils. I'm going to put my oils in these wells and use some various different sizes sponges to apply them, and we'll get into that technique in a second here. But just looking at the reference photos, I wanted to kind of make sure that I captured enough of that tonal variation. There's a lot of different fading that happens, and I've picked these colors, so Starship Base Sludge here, and then I've picked out Medium Gray, and then Earth or Dark Brown. Yeah, it's Dark Brown. That's the next one I show here. And then this is Earth, and finally wrapping it up with some Dark Mud. Just to give a lot of tonal variation, I tried out a couple different colors on the bottom of the hull that'll never be seen, just to see what I liked the most. I had a set of browns and grays, I had a set of greens, and then I had a set of blues, and after doing it all, comparing with the reference photos and just what I think looked the best, I decided to go with this set of colors here. For each of the colors, I'm going to take them out of their little bottle and put them in a well. It makes them just easier to work with for this sponge post shading technique. And then to do the post shading technique, I'm just going to grab the color that I want to use and a sponge to go along with it. And then I'm just going to sponge that color onto the surface pretty densely, but over a small area. And then I'm just going to rinse and repeat with a different color. I usually like to test it either on my thumbnail or on a piece of shop towel. Just that way I can make sure the pattern's nice and it's not going to leave giant globs, because I want to keep this kind of tight. And then I'm going to apply more as needed, grabbing a different kind of random amount of each color every time. And we will get into blending it in just a few seconds here. So once I've laid out enough of the colors, I'm just going to grab a brush, damp with enamel spirits, and basically stipple the oils into the surface. Now I've got multiple colors on here, and having those multiple colors will help them blend together on the surface of the model and just increase the amount of tonal variation on the surface of the model, just adding further visual interest again to what would otherwise be a black tube. And here's the result of that post-shading effect. It just adds more tonal variation, like I've said probably 15 times by now, but I really like this effect. I find it to be much more controllable to do with oils, vise, and airbrush, but once that's dried over the course of 2 days, I'm now going to apply another layer of gloss clear just to aid, again, in having a slick surface for the next step. And the next step here is going to be applying a black wash just in between all of the little rectangles to make them pop, and also because right now it is kind of gray because of the gray primer and because of the fact that I didn't do a black base like I normally would. If I had done a black base, it would have gotten the space in between the little rectangles black, but I chose to use a black wash instead, even though I generally don't use a black wash, just because I find it's too much contrast for most applications. And to do this, I'm just going to take the black wash after shaking it up real good, and again, put it in a well. I like working out of these little wells just because it's easier to see how deep the brush is going into the paint, and I can control how much paint is on the brush a lot better. From there, I'm just going to pick up a little bit of the black wash and then touch it into the surface, and because of that gloss coat, it should flow very nicely into the surface. I've already gone ahead and removed the excess on the front half here, but let's remove the excess on the back half here together in case you've never worked with a wash. You'll need some white spirits if you're using an enamel wash like I am, and then I like to use a wide flat brush, again just damp with enamel spirits. Generally speaking, if you're removing something, you want the brush to be damp, not wet. And then I just take that brush and gently rub it over the surface, pretty much perpendicular, the handle of the brush, perpendicular to the panel line that the wash is in, if that makes sense. I find that if I do it the other way, so if I rotated the brush 90 degrees clockwise, I find that I pull too much of the wash out of the panel gap, and in this instance where I want a lot of contrast, I want to make sure I don't pull basically any wash out of that panel gap. With that done, it is finally time to add the decals, and there's really only about 6 to do on this one. I'm going to leave the numbers off just because generally the reference photos show that when they're at sea, they don't have the numbers on them. And I usually like to work one decal at a time, so I'll just cut it out using scissors, which is actually something recently that I've started doing. I've used a hobby knife basically up until now, until this year. And then I will take that decal and drop it in a cup of distilled water. You can use tap water, and warm water will help lift the decal from the backing paper faster than cold water or room temperature water. But I don't have distilled tap water, so I just use a jug and pour it in there and just wait a couple extra seconds. While that's doing its thing in the water, I will take some micro set and apply it to the surface of where the decal is going to go. Microset just helps with surface tension and helps the decal lay down better. And then when the decal is free to slide around on the backing paper, I will simply just slide the decal into place. Make sure that it is exactly where I want it using some tweezers. Remove any excess water and microset with a Q-tip here, adjust position as needed, and use the fact that the microset does kind of soften the decal, and then decal like this, and use the Q-tip to help ease the decal into a few of the crevices that are around there. And then once I've got the decal exactly where I want it, I will take some microsol and brush it over the decal. Microsol helps melt the decal into the surface of the paint and makes that decal look like it's painted on. And it really helps, I find anyway, with adhesion between the decal and the underlying surface. If you have a particularly stubborn decal, grab a hairdryer and just blow some hot air over the surface of the decal. That'll help soften it and get the sol to do its thing a little bit more. And then once all of the decals are finally on, like I said, really only 6, I'm going to apply the final clear coat, this matte super clear from MRP. And while that is fully drying, I am also going to apply some semi-gloss black to the prop before I do some extreme metal. I find that gives the nicest metallic finish. Now we can move on to the weathering process, and I'm just going to mark the water line here based on reference photos about what looks right. This is just going to be a guide. I'm using a pencil here. I tried freehanding this on the last 1/700th boat I did, but I wasn't too happy with it, so this time I decided to just grab a pencil and mark that line all the way around so it's nice and clear as to where I need to stop my weathering. And the pencil won't be visible in the end, so it is really just an aid. To do the weathering here, I'm going to mix up some medium gray Starship Bay sludge and some dust in a well, and apply it using that sponge technique we used for the post shading, basically just up to the waterline and a little bit down. I'm going to mix all the colors together in the well using a silicone clay shaping tool, and just find that using this helps mix them nicely. And then once they're all mixed up, I'm just going to sponge it on. I'm going to sponge it on a lot heavier than I did with the post shading effect. And I'm also going to use a much drier brush when I go to blend it together. This will leave more of the oil on the surface and help it look more like a filter. Here I'm using a #1 brush with white spirits. Again, white spirits because I'm using an oil-based paint. But I'm using a #1 brush just because it allows me to be a little bit tighter than the #2 I used earlier and gives me more control over the effect. And then once I've got a section done, I'm just going to grab another brush here, again damp with enamel spirits, and just kind of find where that graphite pencil line was and remove the excess so there's a nice clean edge as if there was water sitting there over a long amount of time. Here's the result of that effect, and it's just our first layer, and while that first layer dries, I'm going to move on to applying a few areas of rust on the sail and up towards the bow on the VLS tube doors based on some reference photos that I'm showing here. As an aside, I got these off of NavSource. It's a great resource if you are building any US ship. Lots of reference photos of basically every ship in the class. So to do this rust streaking effect, I like to add some dots of oil to the surface of where I want the streak to originate from. So in this instance, it's going to be from the front leading edge of a few of the VLS tube doors. And I'm just going to add a small dot of the rust colored oil paint using a very fine, this is a 000 Series 7 brush from Winsor & Newton. Just basically to give me the precision I need, and you can see the top of my head leaning into the right side of the screen there, just because I'm getting super up close with the model to make sure I'm applying these dots in a small enough size that I want and where I want pretty much. Then I'll take some white spirits and somewhere between damp and wet, which makes no sense at all. Slightly wetter than damp, but slightly drier than soaking wet. Again, no sense whatsoever. I know that's not that helpful, but I will get my brush slightly wetter than damp. There we go. And basically just take that dot, and then from one side of that dot, drag it back in the direction that I want the streak to go. And I know this is very hard to see. I am zoomed in as much as my camera allows and at the edge of focal length, so I do apologize for that. But like I said, you just start at that dot with a fairly damp brush and just drag the streak, drag the oil from the edge of that dot in the direction that you want to go. This does take a little bit of practice, but because you are using oils in this instance, or at least I'm using oils in this instance, if you're not happy with how the streak has turned out, you can just get more white spirits or enamel thinners and remove the streak completely and try again. Here is the result of doing all of that on the sail. I also used some medium gray back there towards, I think, what is like the diesel exhaust or a steam vent or something. But I used some medium gray just to replicate the staining back there. And here's the result of the rust streaks up front. And again, I apologize, can't zoom in anymore, but I hope this is clear enough for you. To get that rust staining around each of these little panels, I'm just taking the same oil color paint and adding it into that gap there. And then I will take the same brush, damp with enamel spirits, remove it from basically the top of the panel, and just leave it in the gap and outside of the gap, away from the panel. And I'll use a little bit more white spirits than I normally would, just to allow the oil paint to flow around the panel line, as opposed to kind of just stay stuck in position. I think this gives a nice realistic appearance, but again, it's all kind of up to personal preference at the end of the day. So with that first layer of grime done and fully dried from here down, basically this line is representing all the dead algae that has been basically baked on by the sun. But now we want to get into the live algae that is underneath this line here. I'm going to be using some slimy grime dark and slimy grime light. Say that 5 times fast. And then I've grabbed a few different colors of oil brusher. I think I'm going to go with this olive green and dust and kind of mix this up in a 50-50 or a 60-40 ratio. Maybe add in some field green. Basically just working off of reference photos to mix up a color that I think matches what I see. And I've settled on this olive green and dust here. I think it matches closely. It was a little more green than I wanted, but I think once we get this encased in resin, I think it'll be a nice contrast and it will be still pretty visible. So with this technique, I am applying it again thick, and this is going to be even thicker than the first layer of the muck and grime that we did, but I'm going to apply this fairly thick because I want a good buildup of algae basically from the bottom of this beige gray layer all the way down to kind of the middle of the hull, because algae doesn't grow underneath the middle of the hull, at least I think. Looking at reference photos here, that's what it shows. I think that's just probably because there's no sun underneath the hull and algae needs sun to grow. But I'm using a number 6 brush in this instance, and again, just stippling in very tight circles with a very dry, almost completely dry brush. There's still some enamel spirits on here, just so I can blend the paint together, but it is really just to blend it together. I don't want to remove much, if any, of this oil, and if there is an area that I have removed too much of this oil, I'll come back with the sponge and add some more. With this layer done, I want to add some dark algae in between this lighter algae and that brownish gray color. Just looking at reference photos again, there appears to be this area of kind of dead, baked on algae, and then this very fine stripe of dark, thick, healthy algae, and then a basically just layer of algae and muck kind of over the rest of the hull. I'm using that very fine brush and some slimy grime dark here, and I'm just going to kind of paint it in a random pattern. Looking at reference photos, it isn't a clean line, so it's not like a band of algae. It's got some randomness to it, and I felt that just painting it in would be better than trying to use that sponge technique over a very narrow area like this. So I'm just going ahead and painting it in. With that band of slimy grime dark done, I took some of this dark green and just cut that band in half so there's a true water line where it is the freshest algae, and then you've got that slimy grime dark coming off of that, and then I want to add some slimy grime dark only on the underneath side, and I'm going to use the same technique that I used to apply the slimy grime dark. For the third and final layer of weathering, I'm mixed up an 80-20 mixture of dust and that olive green to add that final layer of muck. It's not quite algae based on the reference photos, but there is definitely a layer of muck that happens kind of from that midpoint on the hull down and presumably all the way underneath through the bottom. And again, I'm going to apply this in a pretty heavy manner, but not quite as heavy as I applied the previous layer of weathering. And then I'm going to use a flat round brush here, pretty wet with white spirits, and just go through and blend this over. I want this to be a filter, pretty much a filter, but I want there to be some sort of random variation of areas that are more pigmented just to add some visual interest, although I'm not sure how much of this will be seen once it is encased in resin. But it's fun practice regardless. And with that done, I am going to call the painting and weathering of Project Insanity, or the VERTREP diorama that I plan on doing here, I'm going to call that done. This was definitely quicker than I expected, and I feel like something's missing. So let me know down below if you agree something's missing, or if I could add something. It just went quicker than I expected. You know, I think that's maybe because I'm used to armor and planes where there's a lot more panels and a lot more weathering. You can kind of do a lot more chipping, and I didn't feel that chipping in 1 to 3/50th anyway was quite appropriate. But now that we've got this done, I think I'm going to take a little break from monotony and crazy things and build the helicopter next. This 1 to 3/50th CH-53 that will be part of the diorama, kind of roundabout here. Yeah, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed watching the process of painting and weathering a 1 to 350th scale submarine. Enjoy these final shots, and if you don't want to miss the conclusion of this project, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. That way you don't miss any future videos of this project or anything else I get up to. Thanks.